The American Revolution was a political upheaval during the last half of the 18th century, in which 13 colonies of North America joined together to break free from the British Empire. They first rejected the authority of the British Parliament to govern from the overseas without representation, and then expelled all royal officials.
The Americas, or popularly as it was called in the 15th and 16th centuries, the New World, was discovered almost by an accident in the 1490s. In the years that followed, the Iberian peoples of Spain and Portugal emphasized on gradually moving in and colonizing the southern part of the New World, largely because the resourceful empires of the Incas and the Aztecs were concentrated in Central and Southern America, in what is today Mexico, Bolivia, Peru, so on and so forth. By comparison, the northern part of America, what is today the United States of America and Canada, tended to be much less and much less endowed with resources. The colonization of the northern part of America began essentially with British and French efforts of, as it were, extending their hinterlands in terms of naval strength, in terms of fishing bases, only in the middle of the 16th century. Nevertheless, the colonies of Northern America played no major role in the economies of either British or the French in the 16th century. In proper substance, the significance of the northern regions of America began to be unleashed upon the British, began to be realized by the British towards the closing years of Elizabethan era, especially through the efforts of people like Sir Walter Raleigh, who considered the naval presence in the northern part of the American continent a useful method of harassing the arch adversary Spain with its own naval formations in the south.
When King James I succeeded to the throne of England after Queen Elizabeth, England tilted heavily towards Catholicism. Many a Protestant was imprisoned for plotting against the king. The Protestants felt threatened and migrated out of England to start life afresh in the New World.
By the time of the English Civil War, towards the middle of the 17th century, the significance of the New World as colonies of settlement began to dawn upon the British. And particularly with the period of Cromwellian rule and then the restoration of the Catholic rulers, the Catholic dynasty of the Stuarts, the lure of America as an alternative destination, as colony of settlement, began to emerge among a large number of people. Particularly the Puritans, the extreme Protestants who had found little reason to rejoice in the restoration of the Stuarts, they began a flow of emigration into the New World, where they would find the utopia that they had wanted to devise at the end of the Civil War, and in which they were flustered with the return of the Catholic rulers ruling over an Anglican England. The settlers began to settle primarily along the eastern seaboard. These were the 13 colonies which were running from Boston and Massachusetts in the north right down to the edges of what was later to become Mexico, especially up to the Carolinas. And upon settling in this region, the English settlers over there began to interact with the flow of migrants from other parts of Europe, especially Germany and Scandinavia, who had come to the northeastern seaboard of the Americas looking for the plentiful supply of fish like cod. Gradually, as the British settlements began to expand deeper inland, and the discovery of products like maize, and with growing commerce and commercial exchanges with the Indian tribes, particularly of the Iroquois in the northeastern seaboard, the colonial commerce began to sustain the settlements that were emerging in the northeastern seaboard, and because of the significance of the northeastern seaboard as almost a staging point of commerce across the Americas, the interest of the British Crown also began to grow in the Americas. Colonies of settlement developing not only in the Caribbean and also in the northeastern seaboard were considered, however, to be of secondary significance, both in strategic and in economic terms in the long run. For the British, a much greater source of prosperity and a much greater source of political power was considered to be found even at that date in the Indian Ocean. As a result, the colonies of settlement of the 13 colonies of settlement on the northeastern seaboard of America were developing almost in substantial freedom. The arrangement that had been attained was that the 13 colonies would have their own assemblies. These colonial assemblies were meant primarily to raise funds that were needed for the day-to-day administration and law and order, or the basic provisions of law and order that had to be put in place. And any major act of legislation would nevertheless have to be carried out by the Houses of Parliament. And following the general trend of political general trend of governance, general trend of political theory in Europe, it had been agreed more or less tacitly, because there was no such written deal, there was no written constitution, that while resource mobilization would be taking place at the local level, all calculations, all considerations for the British Empire would have an automatic upper hand in the matters dealing with the colonies of settlement. There was very real reason why the American colonies, some of which were becoming Catholic majority and some of which were remaining Puritan majority, should not have wanted to go their own separate ways. The driving rationale in retaining the old imperial connection had been a genuine attachment with the mother country. In that sense, none of the colonies, which were English majority, actually wanted to ever drift away from the British Isles.
But there was more to it than patriotism and longing for one's motherland.
There was an additional dimension. As the growing number of English settlers and German settlers began to move into these 13 colonies, there was a need to generate their own agricultural produce for the colonies to be more or less self-sufficient in food. So there were attempts at reclamation of land from the interior. So there was a westwards drive within a few decades of American colonies beginning to come up. And in this case, the westward drive brought the settlers of these 13 colonies into direct conflict with the people that Columbus had called the Indians, that is the American Indians or the Raid Indians. The various Indian people in the American continent, they began to fight for space with the British. Now, it's not that it was always a relation of conflict, because the first round of exchanges that happened were commercial.
By the middle of the 17th century, commercial exchange gave way to territorial conflict.
By the early 18th century, it developed a triangular dimension, because there were tribes that had aligned with the French, and there were tribes that were aligning, the Indian tribes that were aligning with the British, and there were colonial wars between the French colonists, the British colonists, and the Indians. And this, by the middle of the 18th century, it had developed into a spate of around 4 or 5 major wars of conquest by either side. Frequently, they converged with wars in Europe on matters pertaining to European politics, such as the War of Austrian Succession or even before that for the War of Spanish Succession, and finally, as we would see, during the 7 Years' War. But nevertheless, whenever Britain and France went to war on any matter pertaining to Europe, it immediately developed a colonial dimension.
So the English colonists grew to depend on the British Royal Army to protect them from the French colonial expansion.
The real transformative event of the 18th century, therefore, has to be seen in the French defeat in a series of wars during the middle of the 18th century. In 1760, the British capture of Louisbourg ultimately finalized the loss of French Quebec to the British Empire. This also had a much more deeper seated long run consequence, because the cost of the war that William Pitt fought against the French was prohibitive.
William Pitt was the youngest Prime Minister of Great Britain and gave leadership in bringing Britain out of the crisis of the American Revolution.
As a result, Pitt put in a decisive amount of resource in the 7 Years' War in the American continent, which led to French defeat. This resulted, in the wake of fall of William Pitt, in a series of measures taken by the British Parliament to mobilize resources which would then help maintain a British military presence in the 13 colonies of the seaboard. This was considered in its turn to be a total violation of the basic understanding that underpinned the colonial order in the Americas. Because as we have begun by suggesting, that the undertaking had always been that the resources to be mobilized for the administration of the northeastern seaboard of America, of the 13 colonies, would be generated by the colonists themselves. Whenever some funds were required, they would be mobilized by the colonies themselves using their colonial assemblies. The British troops that would be maintained in the colonial setting would have to be paid for by the colonists using taxes that they themselves would levy unto themselves. And this, as I said, formed mainframe European political thinking that no person could be deprived of his property without his consultation.
The American Revolutionary era began in 1763 in response to a series of taxes levied on the colonists by the British government.
When, however, the Navigation Acts of 1760 were brought in by the British, it amounted to something like an impost on the colonies. The Navigation Act basically detailed the manner in which duties would be imposed upon the colonies in order to ship products from the Caribbean colonies of Britain, or to bring in products from mainland Europe.
The English Navigation Acts were a series of laws that restricted the use of foreign shipping for trade between England and its colonies. Their goal was to force colonial development into lines favorable to England and stop direct colonial trade with Netherlands, France, and European countries. These acts also formed the basis of British overseas trade for nearly 200 years.
In the Navigation Act, it was very clearly mentioned that the purpose of the Act is to mobilize resources that would be ultimately used for maintaining a colonial military presence, or a military presence in the colonies. For the 13 colonies of the northeastern seaboard, this was momentous violation of the precedent, because the Navigation Acts were being passed not by the colonies themselves but by the House of Parliament. And the colonies began to make this argument that this was in violation to the existing understanding. The demands for its repeal that were generated became so strident that after a time this was ultimately discontinued. The Navigation Acts were repealed. The colony argument was that this was becoming too prohibitively expensive for the colonies to import stuff from Britain and the other Caribbean regions, so they began a policy of import substitution. And the repeal was not because it was being admitted that the colonists had a point, but because the argument was that the British exports were also suffering as a result. This was what ultimately led to the Stamp Act.
The purpose of this tax was to help pay for troops stationed in North America after the British victory in the 7 Years' War. The Stamp Act of 1765 was a direct tax imposed by the British Parliament on the colonies of British America. The Act required all the legal documents, business records, magazines be printed on stamp papers produced in London. The stamp tax had to be paid in valid British currency and not colonial paper money. The British government felt that the colonies were the primary beneficiaries of this military presence and should pay at least a portion of the expenses. This act threatened every single American and would drain all coinage from the colonies.
The argument was that this was an imposition by a parliament in which the colonists were not represented. If this had to be done, if money had to be extracted from the colonies by virtue of acts passed by the British Parliament, then, as James Otis of Massachusetts began to make an argument, that the colonists would have to be represented. He raised this famous slogan of no taxation without representation. That is to say that the American colonists could not be levied any kind of imposts by the British Parliament because the Americans were not represented there. It does not mean that the Americans demanded representation in the British Parliament. They were simply asking for an autonomous space within the empire. But in the 1770s, a further amount of aggravation took place when it was decided that the East India Company, going through a brief period of financial hardship on account of its adventures in India, would be allowed to trade directly with the American colonies, bypassing this previous system of middlemen. What used to happen was tea acquired by the East India Company from India and China, mainly China, was exported to London. From London, the British merchants sold the tea to the American merchants, and then the American merchants would distribute it locally. What the Tea Act of 1772-73 tried to push through was that the East India Company could sell its tea directly to American small traders. So the middlemen, the British middlemen and the American middlemen would both be eliminated. When this happened, this was ultimately going in some ways to make tea cheaper, but it began to affect the interest of the American tea merchants. And this was then considered to be in the same spirit as the British Empire or the British imperial logic being used by London to impose an arbitrary decision on the American colonies. This is what led in 1773-74 to the series of events that ultimately culminated with the Boston Tea Party.
The Boston Tea Party was a direct action by colonists in Boston against the British government and monopolistic East India Company that controlled all the tea coming into the colony. On December 16, 1773, after officials in Boston refused to return 3 shiploads of taxed tea to Britain, a group of colonists boarded the ships and destroyed the tea by throwing it into Boston Harbor. The incident remains an iconic event of American history.
This growing realization that the American colonists were able to meet their own military needs of protection had begun to sink in with the loss of Quebec by France. What really transpired in the direction of the drift, transpired in the drift in the direction of American independence was British insistence over a period of 20 to 30 years that colonial protection has to be maintained by a body of troops mobilized by British using resources from the colonies, which were to be issued, taxes were to be passed by the British Parliament. It was the last bit that made the colonies suspicious. Why was the mother country so adamant on imposing taxes in order to maintain a standing army, which was probably no longer required because the French had already been driven out? And at this stage, the colonies of the northeastern seaboard were not particularly keen, and they were not even considering taking on the might of the Spanish Empire to the western part. So the colonies began to consider the possibility that at every turn that the British imperial logic was imposed by London on the colonies and imposing taxes in the name of the empire, it would have to be resisted.
By 1774, each colony had established a provincial congress or an equivalent governmental institution to form self-governing states. The British responded by sending combat troops to reimpose direct rule.
The Declaration of Independence was issued in 1776 as a follow-up to the Declaration of Rights of the Citizen. It was the assertion of the American colonists of their freedom from the arbitrary exactions to be imposed by the British Parliament. There was, even at this stage of the Declaration of Independence, ultimately no definite determination to break away from the British Empire. However, upon the Declaration of Independence, the British Empire began, as it were, to fight back.
The American War of Independence began on April 19, 1775 with the battles of Lexington and Concord and ended on October 19, 1781 with the surrender of Yorktown. At the outset of the war, the 13 colonies lacked a professional army or navy. Each colony provided for its own defenses with local militia. Militia men were lightly armed, had little training, and usually did not have uniforms. Throughout the war, the British were able to use their naval superiority to capture and occupy American coastline cities. But control of the countryside largely eluded them because of the relatively small size of their land army.
In a series of conflicts that were to follow between the colonists and the British Empire actually managed to find a large number of allies even among the colonists, people who were completely opposed to the idea of breaking away from the empire. But once British troops landed in the northeastern seaboard and they began to fight, the distinction between the loyalists and the colonial independent, the freedom fighters for independence, began to get blurred. And land of either, both the loyalists and the freedom fighters, began to be ravaged. This, in a way, began to mobilize a large number of Americans behind the freedom fighters. And led by George Washington at the Battle of Saratoga, the British forces led by Lord Cornwallis were decisively defeated. In this struggle, the Americans first found support from the French, who were basically cutting their nose to spite the British face.
French involvement proved decisive, with the French naval victory in the Chesapeake leading at Yorktown in 1781 to the surrender of a second British army.
With decisive, crucial French support, ultimately the Americans emerged triumphant over the British, not only in a series of land battles, but also by virtue of the fact that this war was becoming too expensive to be considered worthwhile. The British Empire gradually decided to pull out in order to cut its losses, because the amount of money that was being spent in fighting in the Americas was not likely to be compensated by means of colonial commerce.
Losing the war and the 13 colonies was a shock to the British system. The war revealed Britain's fiscal military condition when it had powerful enemies and no allies. Extended and vulnerable lines of communication across the Atlantic also went against the British in the War of American Independence.
The final acceptance on the part of the British came in 1783 in a treaty in Paris, as a result of which the independent status of the 13 colonies which were by now calling themselves the United States of America, was acknowledged by the British Empire.
In 1783, the Treaty of Paris ended the war. On December 2, 1782, King George III of Great Britain announced the recognition of 13 United States that were earlier 13 British colonies. The Treaty of Paris was signed by Benjamin Franklin, John Adams, and John Jay. Thus, the sovereignty of the United States was established over the territory bounded by what is now Canada to the north, Florida to the south, and the Mississippi River to the west. The United States allowed British troops in America to leave and also agreed to pay all existing debts owed to Great Britain. The peace in 1783 left France financially drained, but British economy boomed thanks to the return of American business.
Ironically, it was only after severing its ties with the British Empire that the commerce of the former colonies, the United States of America, with Great Britain began to rise, it began to shoot up. And the special relationship that the British and the Americans forged then, barring for a brief period in 1812, has never been shaken since.